34 years is a long time to wait for a name. Long enough for evidence to gather dust in freezers. Long enough for witnesses to age, memories to blur, and families to wonder if justice forgot them. In Norfolk, Virginia, a sailor's murder became just another file until science reached back through decades of silence. When DNA finally spoke, it named someone who had walked free all along, hidden in plain sight. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Late afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia, 1986, clouds pressed down on the city where naval life set the rhythm for everything else. Ships docked and departed. Sailors rotated through assignments. The base never slept, and neither did the apartment complexes surrounding it. Philip J. Geary walked his building's corridor with steady purpose. At 32, the U.S. Navy petty officer moved through the world without drawing attention. He nodded to a neighbor unloading groceries, held the door for an older woman returning from the mailboxes, remembered her name when she thanked him. Inside his apartment, order ruled. Bed made, uniform pressed, boots lined near the door. He had learned discipline before the Navy, but the service refined it into something that guided every choice. Tomorrow morning, he would wake at the same time and walk to base without missing formation. He never missed formation. Outside his window, the base sprawled like a city within a city. Ships sat in dry dock, welded and painted by civilian contractors who came and went with each contract. Philip's world intersected with theirs only in passing, at gates and parking lots, in the machinery hum that never stopped. Evening descended slowly. Philip checked the time and straightened his jacket. He had somewhere to be. Later, investigators would reconstruct this moment from shadows and gaps, guessing at intention because no one saw him leave. But for now, in the last ordinary hour of his life, Philip simply moved through another day, unaware it would be his last. Streets near the base pulsed with shift changes. Workers climbed into trucks. Sailors walked toward the gate. Bars on the main strip began to fill, neon signs glowing brighter as daylight faded. Norfolk thrived on transients. People came for months or years, then scattered. Friendships formed and dissolved. Nothing stayed still for long. Philip moved through this landscape as one figure among thousands. His face was familiar to some, unknown to most. In a city where people rotated constantly, anonymity came easily. A sailor could vanish into the crowd, and unless someone looked for him, no one would notice until roll call. Shipyard contractors were different from military personnel, bound by paychecks rather than orders. They worked docks and dry docks, hauling equipment under foremen who cared only about deadlines. Some lived in Norfolk permanently, others drifted in from neighboring towns. The two populations coexisted without much overlap. Jurisdictional lines cut through the city in ways most residents never considered. The base belonged to military authority. Streets beyond the gate fell under local police. When something happened in the gray zone between them, questions arose about who held responsibility, who gathered evidence, who led investigations. As darkness settled, streetlights flickered on in uneven intervals. Some blocks glowed brightly, others remained dim. Bulbs burned out or broken, casting shadows where concrete met asphalt. People moved through these pockets of darkness without concern, trusting the base's presence to maintain order. Philip passed through one dim stretch that evening, his destination unclear, his purpose unknown. Behind him, the apartment complex settled into its nightly rhythm. The world continued, indifferent, unaware that one of its own was about to slip through a crack no one had seen. Night in Norfolk carried a chill that cut through jackets. The apartment complex where Philip lived sat quiet under weak streetlights that buzzed and flickered. Parking spaces stretched in uneven rows, some filled with cars that had not moved in days. Shadows pooled thick between buildings. Philip stepped out and locked his door. The deadbolt clicked softly. He pocketed his keys and turned toward the parking lot, shoulders squared, pace unhurried. Investigators would later believe he intended only a quick errand, picking something up, meeting someone briefly, returning within the hour. Nothing suggested urgency or fear. No one came forward to say they saw him leave. No neighbor glanced out at the right moment. No passerby crossed his path. Surveillance technology that would later become common did not yet exist here. Beyond the gates, the world relied on human memory, and memory required presence. The parking lot swallowed him into unlit corners. Somewhere between his door and wherever he intended to go, Philip J. Geary's life ended. The exact sequence dissolved into darkness, leaving only fragments for others to piece together later. From this point forward, every fact about Philip's final moments would be reconstructed backward, assembled from physical traces and absence rather than testimony. The gap between his departure and the discovery of his body became a void that decades of investigation could not fully illuminate. The night continued indifferent. In apartments around him, life moved forward. Televisions played. Conversations murmured through walls. Somewhere in the city, someone carried knowledge of what had just occurred and said nothing. The body lay motionless in cold air. Dawn had not yet broken when a passerby noticed the shape on pavement near the apartment complex. Confusion gave way to recognition, then alarm. The call went out just after 3 a.m. Police arrived within minutes, headlights cutting through darkness as they cordoned off the area. The scene told a story, but not a clear one. Philip J. Geary lay near the parking lot's edge in a poorly lit section where streetlights had burned out. His injuries were immediately visible. Blunt force delivered with intent. Blood pooled beneath him. Officers moved carefully, marking evidence with numbered placards. Some of Philip's belongings were missing. His wallet was gone. A watch he usually wore was no longer on his wrist, but other items remained scattered nearby. Keys, loose change, a folded piece of paper. The pattern confused first responders. If this was robbery, why leave anything behind? Photographs were taken from every angle, scattered items, body position, blood spatter patterns. Each detail was documented with understanding that this moment, frozen by camera flashes and evidence bags, might be the only chance to capture what happened. Detectives arrived as the sky lightened, faces grim in gray dawn. They crouched near the body, studying wounds, positioning missing and present belongings. One detective noted the area's poor lighting had likely given the attacker cover. Another pointed out that certain item placements seemed deliberate, as if someone had tried to create a specific impression. By the time the medical examiner arrived, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the tape's edge, whispering and peering toward the scene. Some recognized the victim. The body was lifted onto a stretcher under harsh portable lights. Investigators' work continuing even as Philip was taken away. By mid-morning, the investigation moved indoors. A conference room at Norfolk Police filled with personnel from multiple agencies. On one side sat local detectives. On the other, military investigators from the base. Between them lay crime scene photographs and preliminary reports. The question was simple but consequential. Who leads this investigation? Philip J. Geary was active duty Navy, placing him under military jurisdiction. But the crime occurred off base, on civilian ground, meaning local police held authority over the scene. A senior detective tapped the photos. His officers collected the evidence. The scene was in their city. They knew the neighborhood, witnesses, local criminal patterns. A military investigator countered that Philip's death might connect to base activities. Relationships formed within service, disputes rooted in military life. The tension was not hostile, but it slowed everything. Time spent negotiating authority was time not spent chasing leads. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Joint investigation, shared resources, coordinated interviews. It sounded efficient on paper. In practice, it meant doubled meetings and occasional confusion. Physical evidence sat in labeled bags on a side table: blood samples, hair, trace materials from Phillips' clothing and the pavement. Investigators knew these samples might hold the key to identifying the attacker, but 1986 technology offered limited options. DNA analysis existed in theory, discussed in journals and tested in a few cases, but was not yet standard practice. Still, detectives made note of what they had. Biological evidence was carefully preserved, sealed in conditions meant to prevent degradation. A clerk documented chain of custody, recording every hand that touched the samples. No one knew if the evidence would ever be useful, but the principle was clear: preserve everything, discard nothing. As the meeting broke, officers dispersed to begin interviews and canvassing. The case file officially opened, stamped with the date and Phillips' name. The forensic lab in 1986 was modest, fluorescent lights humming over metal tables and equipment representing the era's cutting edge. Detectives delivered sealed evidence bags with careful instructions. Catalog everything. Test what can be tested, preserve the rest. Lab technicians worked methodically, gloved hands opening each bag and transferring contents to sterile containers. Blood samples were divided into aliquots. Hair strands were mounted on slides and examined under microscopes. Trace materials were cataloged and stored. Every step was documented in handwritten logs. The lead technician explained limitations to waiting detectives. Blood typing could narrow possibilities, but could not identify an individual. Hair analysis could show characteristics: color, texture, chemical treatment, but could not definitively link a strand to one specific person. DNA testing existed in research labs and a few pioneering facilities, but the process was expensive, time-consuming, and not yet reliable enough for widespread criminal use. One technician, more cautious than others, made a decision that would matter decades later. Instead of using all biological material for immediate testing, she set aside portions in sealed vials, labeling them carefully and placing them in a freezer set to -20 degrees Celsius. Preservation was meticulous. Each sample double-bagged, each label marked with case number, date, and material type. If technology improved, she reasoned, evidence might still be viable. Detectives left with preliminary results offering little direction. The blood type matched Phillips, confirming his injuries but providing no clues about his attacker. Other materials yielded no immediate suspects. Reports were filed, evidence logged, and biological samples placed in long-term storage, waiting for a future no one could predict. Outside the lab, news coverage remained minimal. A brief newspaper mention: Navy sailor found dead near base housing. The case officially remained active, but as weeks passed without breakthroughs, the pace slowed. Interviews filled the next weeks. Detectives moved through the apartment complex, knocking on doors and asking the same questions. Did you know Philip Geary? Did you see anything unusual that night? Have you noticed anyone acting strangely since? Most neighbors remembered Philip vaguely: polite, quiet, always in uniform or workout clothes, always heading somewhere with purpose. A few recalled conversations at mailboxes or in the parking lot, brief exchanges about weather or base schedules, but no one reported conflicts, arguments, or signs of trouble. Possible suspects emerged and dissolved. A man with a criminal record who lived 2 buildings over was questioned extensively, but his alibi held. A contractor who worked near the base and had been seen in the area that night was interviewed, but nothing connected him to Philip. Norfolk's transient nature worked against the investigation. Several people who had lived in the complex in early 1986 had already moved. Forwarding addresses were incomplete or outdated. Phone numbers disconnected. Military rotation schedules meant sailors who might have noticed something had shipped out to other bases, scattered across the country, or deployed overseas. One detective noted in the case file that the window for finding witnesses was closing rapidly. Memory fades, people forget, details blur the longer the investigation dragged on without a breakthrough. The harder it would become to reconstruct what happened. Tips trickled in from the public, spurred by brief media coverage. Most led nowhere. A caller reported seeing a suspicious vehicle, but could not provide details. Another claimed to have heard shouting, but could not pinpoint location or identify voices. Among the Navy community, Phillips' murder became a cautionary story. People spoke in low voices about staying aware, avoiding dark parking lots, walking in groups after dark. The case file grew thicker with interview transcripts documenting effort but not progress. Months passed. The case file that once sat prominently on detectives' desks moved to a cabinet, then to a storage room, then finally to a records facility where unsolved cases waited in long rows of metal shelving. Philip J. Geary's name was typed on the folder's spine, visible only when someone pulled it from the shelf. The reclassification was not surrender, but acknowledgement. The case remained officially open, but was no longer active. Detectives would review the file periodically, checking if new information had surfaced, but no resources were dedicated to fresh investigations. The biological evidence was logged into a separate system, stored in a freezer in a climate-controlled facility. Samples were listed by case number, contents described in technical language, blood, hair, trace biological material. A notation indicated DNA analysis had been attempted but did not yield usable matches. A small administrative decision during this process would prove pivotal years later. Instead of discarding evidence after initial analysis, samples were retained and preserved. The decision followed protocol, but protocol itself reflected a forward-looking philosophy: preserve everything because the future might offer tools the present lacks. Phillips' family received updates containing no real news. The investigation remained open. Detectives were still looking into leads, but as months turned into years, language in those updates grew more formulaic, reassurances more hollow. The family understood what was not being said. The case was stalled, and no one expected it to move forward soon. In Norfolk, life continued around the absence. New sailors arrived and rotated through. The apartment complex saw tenants come and go. The parking lot was repaved, bloodstains erased beneath fresh asphalt. The community's memory of the murder faded, reduced to an occasional anecdote. For Philip's loved ones, the world did not move on. Birthdays arrived without him, holidays passed with an empty chair. Years stretched out, measured in seasons that came and went without resolution. Philip's family gathered for holidays, with his absence a constant presence. His chair remained empty at the table. His name was spoken carefully with reverence. Photographs from before his death were placed in frames and kept on shelves. In them, Philip smiled in uniform, young and vital, frozen at 32. The images became how family members remembered him, memories slowly merging with static representations. Each year on the anniversary of his death, someone from the family called the police department to ask if there were updates. The answers were always the same. The case remained open. No new evidence had emerged. If anything changed, the family would be notified. Conversations grew shorter over time, hope more strained. The world moved on in ways that felt cruel. Technology advanced. News cycles turned over. True crime stories gained traction in popular culture, with television shows and podcasts dissecting famous unsolved cases. But Philip's murder never received that attention. It remained a local tragedy, known to a shrinking circle. In Norfolk, the landscape changed. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt. Streets widened. The naval base expanded and modernized. New generations of sailors cycled through, unaware of the petty officer killed decades earlier just beyond the gate. Inside the records facility, Phillips' case file remained untouched for years at a time. Dust settled on the folder. Pages yellowed slightly despite controlled environment. Biological evidence stayed frozen in sealed containers, waiting in silence that felt permanent. But silence is not absence. Evidence does not forget. DNA does not degrade if stored correctly. The truth of what happened to Philip J. Geary in 1986 remained encoded in those samples, patient and unchanging. In 2018, something shifted. Norfolk Police formed a dedicated cold case unit, staffed by detectives and analysts tasked with reviewing unsolved homicides containing preserved biological evidence. The Norfolk Police Cold Case Unit operated out of a small suite of offices. Walls were lined with shelves holding case files, each representing a life interrupted and a family still waiting. Detectives and analysts sat at desks, cluttered with folders, computer screens glowing with databases and genealogical charts. Early 2018, the unit held a meeting to prioritize which cases to revisit first. The lead detective stood at the front, a stack of files on the table. The criteria were clear: cases with preserved biological evidence, cases where technology might now provide answers impossible decades earlier, and cases where families were still seeking closure. Philip J. Geary's file was among those selected. The decision was methodical, not emotional. Evidence from the 1986 crime scene had been stored properly. Blood, hair, and trace materials still existed in sealed containers, frozen and viable. The initial investigation had been thorough, but limited by its time's tools. Now, with advanced forensic DNA sequencing and genetic genealogy, there was a real chance the evidence could speak. A detective pulled Phillips' file from storage and carried it into the workspace. The folder was thick with decades of notes, interview transcripts, and dead-end leads. Photographs from the crime scene were paper-clipped inside, faded but still clear enough to convey the violence. Biological evidence was logged separately. A request was submitted to retrieve samples for retesting. Within days, sealed containers arrived, accompanied by documentation proving they had been undisturbed since initial storage. Discussion turned to methods. Forensic DNA sequencing had advanced dramatically since the 1980s. Modern methods could extract detailed genetic information from tiny traces. Even more promising was genetic genealogy, using DNA to build family trees through public databases where people had uploaded genetic information seeking ancestry knowledge. The Golden State Killer case had demonstrated this approach's power. The unit submitted Phillips' evidence to a forensic lab equipped for advanced DNA analysis. The forensic lab in 2018 bore little resemblance to its 1986 predecessor. Machines hummed with processing power that would have seemed impossible 3 decades earlier. Technicians worked behind protective glass, movements precise as they handled biological evidence that had waited years. Phillips' samples arrived in a secured transport container, each vial labeled and cross-referenced with original case documentation. Lab personnel verified chain of custody, checking signatures and dates to ensure evidence had remained sealed and uncontaminated. Satisfied, they began delicate analysis. Blood samples were thawed slowly, brought from -20 degrees to room temperature in controlled increments to minimize degradation. Hair strands were examined under high-powered microscopes before being processed for DNA extraction. Trace materials underwent chemical analysis to identify cellular material that might yield genetic information. Hours turned into days as machines ran sequencing protocols, building a genetic profile from DNA fragments recovered from the crime scene. When results finally appeared on computer screens, the lead technician reviewed them carefully before calling the cold case unit. A clear, complete DNA profile had been successfully extracted. The next step was comparison. The profile was run through CODIS, the national DNA database containing genetic information from convicted offenders and arrestees. Detectives waited, hoping for a direct match that would immediately identify the person responsible. But when results returned, there was no hit. The DNA did not belong to anyone in the criminal system. This was not the end, only a redirection. The forensic team uploaded the DNA profile to public genealogy websites where millions of people had voluntarily submitted genetic information to learn about ancestry. Within days, the system flagged several matches. None were close relatives, but genetic similarities indicated shared ancestry. These distant cousins, scattered across the country and unaware they were connected to an unsolved murder, became starting points for a genealogical investigation. The workspace transformed into a genealogical research center. Walls were covered with printouts of family trees, branches spreading in all directions, names connected by lines of descent. Sticky notes marked individuals ruled out or flagged for further investigation. Public records were stacked on desks, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries. Forensic genealogists worked methodically, starting with distant relatives identified through DNA matches. Each match represented a shared ancestor somewhere in the past, a common genetic thread connecting people who might never have known each other existed. By analyzing genetic similarity degrees, the team could estimate how many generations back that common ancestor lived. The process required patience. Genealogists traced each match's family line backward through public records, constructing trees that branched outward as they moved into the past. Birth certificates identified parents. Marriage records revealed maiden names. Census data showed where families lived in specific years. Death records closed individual branches, narrowing the field. As trees from different DNA matches began to converge, certain surnames appeared repeatedly. Geographic clusters emerged, indicating families that had stayed in specific regions for generations. The team cross-referenced this information with what was known the crime occurred in Norfolk, Virginia in 1986. The person responsible would have been old enough and physically capable of committing the attack. Branches that did not fit these parameters were systematically ruled out. Relatives too young, too old, or living too far away were marked off. Women were eliminated based on the physical nature of the crime. Weeks of work distilled possibilities down to a smaller subset, men of the right age, living in or near Norfolk in the mid-1980s, connected through genealogy to DNA left at Phillips' crime scene. One name began surfacing with increasing frequency across multiple branches. The genealogist traced his lineage carefully, verifying each connection through documentation. The team gathered around the caseboard as a lead detective drew a red circle around the name, Thomas R. Daniels. Thomas R. Daniels' background unfolded through public records and database searches. Born in the late 1940s, he had worked as a shipyard contractor during the 1980s, moving between projects at naval facilities along the East Coast. Employment records confirmed he had been in Norfolk during 1986, working on maintenance contracts that brought him onto the base and into contact with Navy personnel. His address at the time placed him within a mile of Phillips' apartment complex. He lived alone, kept irregular hours tied to shift work, and moved through the same transient community that defined the area. On paper, his life intersected with Phillips through proximity and shared geography. Detectives dug deeper, searching for any documented connection between Daniels and Phillip. Military records, archived work schedules, and old sign-in logs were reviewed. A pattern emerged. Daniels had worked on projects requiring interaction with base personnel for access and approvals. Phillips' duties occasionally placed him in areas where contractors were present. It established opportunity, moments when their paths could have crossed. More intriguing were hints of tension. Interviews with people who had known both men decades earlier surfaced vague recollections of a dispute. Details were murky. obscured by time and memory's unreliability. One former contractor recalled hearing that Daniels had clashed with a sailor over something related to base access. Another remembered a confrontation in a parking lot, voices raised. None were definitive, but they added context to genetic evidence, suggesting Daniels and Philip were not strangers and their interactions had not always been peaceful. The cold case unit compiled everything into a growing file: Daniels' proximity to the crime scene, his work bringing him into contact with Navy personnel, hints of prior tension with Philip, and beneath it all, biological evidence placing him at the scene on the night Philip was killed. Detectives located people who had known Thomas Daniels during the period surrounding Philip's murder. Some had moved away from Norfolk, scattered across the country. Others still lived nearby. Interviews were conducted carefully without revealing the full investigation scope to avoid contaminating recollections. What emerged was troubling. Multiple witnesses described Daniels returning home shortly after Philip's murder, acting strangely. He seemed paranoid, one said, constantly checking over his shoulder. Another recalled him appearing disheveled and possibly intoxicated, his hands bandaged or bruised in ways suggesting recent injury. When asked what had happened, Daniels had offered vague explanations: a fall, a workplace accident, nothing serious. At the time, no one connected his behavior to the murder that had occurred nearby. The crime had been reported, but details were sparse, and Daniels was not someone who drew attention or suspicion. People accepted his explanations and moved on. Only now, with DNA evidence pointing directly to him, did those old observations take on new significance. One witness recalled a conversation weeks after Philip's death. They had been at a bar, and the murder came up in passing. Daniels had gone silent, his expression darkening. When someone speculated about who might have done it, Daniels said something the witness never forgot. People get what's coming to them. The comment hung in the air, strange and unsettling. These accounts were documented carefully, each witness providing written statements that would later be presented in court. Detectives knew the defense attorney would challenge them. Decades-old memories were inherently unreliable, but the consistency of observations, Daniels' injuries, his paranoia, his cryptic comments, added weight to DNA evidence already pointing to him. One witness expressed guilt for not coming forward sooner. She had sensed something was wrong at the time, but without clear reason to connect Daniels to the murder, she had kept concerns to herself. The case board in the cold case unit now centered entirely on Thomas R. Daniels. Photographs pinned at the top showed him at different life stages. Below his image, lines connected him to the crime scene, witness statements, and the genealogical tree that had led investigators to his name. The lead detective stood before the board, reviewing the evidence synthesis one final time before presenting it to the district attorney's office. DNA was the foundation. Biological material from Philip's crime scene had been preserved, retested, and matched to Daniels through advanced forensic techniques. Genealogical tracing had narrowed distant relatives down to one individual whose age, location, and background aligned with the crime. Daniels' work as a shipyard contractor placed him in Philip's orbit. He lived within a mile of the apartment complex. His duties brought him onto the naval base and into contact with personnel like Philip. Records suggested their paths had crossed before, and interviews hinted at tension, though the exact nature of their dispute remained unclear. Witness statements added human dimension to scientific evidence. People who had known Daniels remembered his strange behavior after the murder, injuries he could not or would not explain, paranoia that seemed disproportionate, comments that felt off. A formal memo was drafted outlining probable cause for arrest. The document detailed DNA evidence, genealogical methodology, Daniels' proximity to the crime scene, his connection to Philip, and witness accounts of his behavior. It included timelines, maps, and forensic reports, all cross-referenced and verified, Chain of custody for biological evidence was documented meticulously, showing samples had remained sealed and uncontaminated since 1986. The memo was delivered to the district attorney's office. Within days, the district attorney approved the arrest. A warrant was issued, and detectives began planning the operation. Thomas R. Daniels, now in his 70s, would be taken into custody more than 34 years after Philip J. Geary's murder. The morning of the arrest was calm, the kind of ordinary day that feels wrong for something extraordinary. Unmarked police vehicles gathered blocks from Daniels' residence, detectives and officers briefing quietly as they reviewed the plan. The operation would be straightforward: approach the house, announce their presence, execute the warrant. Daniels lived in a modest, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood. His car sat in the driveway, suggesting he was home. Detectives approached the front door, movements deliberate, expressions neutral. The knock was firm, a pause. Then the door opened and Thomas R. Daniels stood in the threshold. Older now, his face lined with age, but still recognizable from photographs in the case file. The lead detective identified themselves and stated the purpose clearly. Daniels was under arrest for the murder of Philip J. Geary. Daniels' reaction was unexpected. He did not protest or resist. He did not ask questions or demand to see the warrant. He simply stepped back, face unreadable, and allowed officers to enter. As they read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs, he said only one thing. "I didn't do it," the statement was noted. Daniels was led to a waiting vehicle and transported to the police station for booking. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by police cars and the sight of someone they had known for years being taken into custody. Confusion rippled through the street. At the station, Daniels was processed. Fingerprints, photographs, personal belongings cataloged and stored. He remained silent throughout, offering no explanation and requesting a lawyer. Court records would later document his formal claim of innocence, a position he would maintain through every stage. News of the arrest spread quickly. Local media picked up the story, headlines emphasizing modern DNA technology's role in solving a cold case from 1986. Philip's family learned of the arrest through a phone call from the lead detective. The district attorney's office became the nerve center for trial preparation. Prosecutors spread documents across conference tables, reviewing every piece of evidence, anticipating every challenge the defense attorney might raise. The case against Thomas R. Daniels was strong, but cold cases always carried complications. The prosecutor assigned to the case understood the stakes. This was about demonstrating that preserved evidence and modern science could deliver justice even when decades had passed. It was about showing Philip's family that their wait had not been in vain. The state's theory was clear. Philip's murder was personal, not random. The scene had been staged to look like a robbery, with some belongings taken and in others scattered deliberately to create confusion. But the pattern did not fit opportunistic theft. The attack was targeted, the violence excessive, the staging imperfect. Evidence binders were assembled, each meticulously organized. Crime scene photographs showed scattered belongings and missing items. Forensic reports detailed DNA extraction and analysis. Genealogical charts illustrated how distant relatives' genetic information had led investigators to Daniels. Witness statements described his behavior after the murder. Employment records and address histories placed him near the crime scene with opportunity and means. The prosecutor knew the defense attorney would challenge genetic genealogy methodology. The technique was still relatively new in courtrooms, raising questions about privacy, consent, and reliability. The defense would argue that distant genetic matches were not sufficient to prove guilt, that family tree construction involved assumptions that could be flawed. Witness credibility would also be attacked. Memories from 3 decades earlier were inherently unreliable. People misremember. They conflate events. The defense would argue witnesses' statements were influenced by time's passage and knowledge that Daniels was a suspect. The defense attorney filed pretrial motions challenging the admissibility of genealogical evidence and questioning whether witnesses' statements should be allowed. The judge scheduled hearings to address these motions. The courtroom filled slowly on the morning of the pretrial hearing. Philip's family entered quietly and took their place in the gallery. The weight of decades pressed against the walls, invisible but palpable. The judge took the bench, and the room settled into formal silence. The defense attorney rose first, presenting arguments against admissibility of genetic genealogy evidence. The challenge was articulated carefully. Public genealogy databases were designed for ancestry research, not for law enforcement to identify criminal suspects. The methodology involved interpretations and assumptions. Building a family tree required decisions about which branches to pursue, introducing possibility of error. The prosecutor countered with precedent and science. Genetic genealogy had been used successfully in other high-profile cases, most notably the Golden State Killer investigation. Courts across the country had admitted similar evidence. The public databases clearly stated in their terms of service that law enforcement might access uploaded genetic information. More importantly, the prosecutor emphasized, genetic genealogy was not the only evidence. It was one piece of a larger puzzle. DNA from the crime scene had been preserved and analyzed using accepted methods. Genealogical tracing had narrowed the field to one individual whose age, location, and background aligned with the crime. Witness statements corroborated that this individual's behavior after the murder was consistent with guilt. The judge listened, asked clarifying questions, and reviewed case law. The decision came after careful deliberation. The genetic genealogy evidence would be admitted. The judge noted that methodology had gained acceptance in forensic and legal communities. Procedures used in this case appeared sound, and the jury was capable of weighing the evidence. The defense attorney immediately shifted focus to witness statements, arguing that memories from 3 decades earlier were inherently unreliable. The judge ruled the statements could be presented. It would be up to the jury to decide how much weight to give them. With pretrial motions resolved, the judge set the official trial date. The trial began on a clear morning. The courtroom filled to capacity. The gallery a mixture of Philip's family, observers, and journalists. The jury filed in 12 individuals selected through careful questioning. Their faces were attentive but reserved. The prosecutor stood to deliver the opening statement. The narrative presented was direct and methodical. On a night in 1986, Philip J. Geary left his apartment for what should have been a brief errand. He never returned. His body was found hours later, attacked with force, some belongings missing while others were scattered in a pattern suggesting staging rather than chaos. For decades, the case went unsolved, but investigators of 1986 made a decision that would prove pivotal. They preserved biological evidence. In 2018, that evidence was retested using advanced forensic DNA sequencing. A clear genetic profile emerged pointing to one man, Thomas R. Daniels. Genealogical analysis traced DNA through distant relatives to Daniels, whose work placed him near Philip's apartment and whose behavior after the murder raised questions he never answered. The prosecutor paused. This was not a simple case of eyewitness testimony or confession. It was built on science, persistence, and convergence of multiple evidence lines. The state would prove Daniels knew Philip, that tension existed between them, that Daniels was in the area on the night of the murder, that his DNA was at the crime scene, and that his behavior afterward was consistent with guilt. The defense attorney rose next, projecting calm confidence. Thomas Daniels was an innocent man swept up by complex science and unreliable memories. Genetic genealogy was new and controversial, prone to error and misinterpretation. Distant genetic matches proved only that Daniels shared ancestors with other people, not that he committed a crime. Witnesses claiming to remember Daniels' behavior from 3 decades earlier were recalling events through time's distorting lens. And what about motive? The prosecution would offer hints, but no clear reason why Daniels would have killed Philip. Second day brought forensic scientists to the stand. The courtroom's attention shifted to screens mounted on walls, where diagrams and charts would illustrate DNA's invisible world. The first expert was a forensic DNA analyst who had worked on Philip's case re-examination. Under the prosecutor's questioning, the analyst explained the process in language designed for jurors without scientific backgrounds. Biological evidence, blood, hair, trace materials, had been collected from the crime scene in 1986 and stored in controlled conditions. In 2018, that evidence was thawed and subjected to advanced DNA extraction techniques that had not existed 3 decades earlier. The analyst described how DNA sequencing worked, identifying specific genetic markers that vary between individuals, building a profile that is statistically unique. The profile extracted from Philip's crime scene evidence was complete enough to be compared against databases and used for genealogical analysis. The DNA was not Philip's. It came from another person who had been present at the scene. Chain of custody documentation was presented, showing evidence had remained sealed since initial collection. Every person who had handled samples was listed, every transfer recorded. The integrity of evidence was uncompromised. Cross-examination by the defense attorney focused on possibility of error. Could samples have been contaminated during storage? Could the extraction process have introduced DNA from other sources? The analyst responded carefully, acknowledging forensic science always involves margins of error, but insisting procedures followed in this case met or exceeded professional standards. The next witness was a forensic genealogist. The genealogist walked the jury through the process step by step. The DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases where it was compared against millions of genetic profiles. Matches were found, not direct relatives, but distant cousins, sharing common ancestors several generations back. Using those matches as starting points, the genealogist constructed family trees. Public records provided raw material. Each tree branched outward and backward through time, mapping relationships and narrowing possibilities. Eventually, branches converged on one individual, Thomas R. Daniels. The trial's third day shifted from science to memory. Witnesses who had known Thomas Daniels decades earlier took the stand, faces showing time's passage, but voices steady as they recounted what they remembered. The first witness was a man who had worked alongside Daniels at the shipyard in 1986. Under the prosecutor's questioning, he described Daniels as generally quiet and competent. But in days after Philip's murder, Daniels had been different. He came to work with visible injuries, scrapes on his hands, a bruise along his jaw. When co-workers asked what happened, Daniels offered vague explanations that did not quite add up. Cross-examination by the defense attorney was sharp. How could the witness be certain these events occurred in days after Philip's murder and not weeks or months later? The witness acknowledged difficulty recalling exact dates, but insisted the general sequence was clear. Daniels' injuries had been noticeable and unusual. The next witness was a woman who had lived in the same apartment complex as Daniels in 1986. She described seeing him return late one night around the time of the murder, his movements unsteady, his appearance disheveled. He kept looking over his shoulder as if afraid someone was following him. At the time, she thought it was odd, but did not connect it to anything criminal. The defense attorney attacked her memory aggressively. How could she be certain it was Daniels she saw that night? How could she remember details like where his car was parked decades later? The witness remained firm. She remembered because it had unsettled her at the time. A third witness testified about a conversation weeks after Philip's death. He and Daniels had been at a bar, and the murder came up in casual conversation. Daniels had gone silent, his expression darkening. When someone speculated about who might have done it, Daniels said, "People get what's coming to them." The prosecutor used redirect to reinforce consistency of observations. Multiple witnesses, interviewed separately, described Daniels' behavior as paranoid, injured, and evasive in the period following Phillips' murder. The trial moved toward its climax. Court records indicated Thomas Daniels maintained his claim of innocence, though he did not take the stand. The defense attorney had advised against it, unwilling to expose Daniels to cross-examination. The prosecutor stood to deliver the closing argument. The case came down to convergence. No single piece of evidence stood alone. Each element reinforced the others, building a picture that became clearer with every layer. Start with DNA. Biological evidence from the 1986 crime scene had been preserved and analyzed using methods accepted by the forensic science community. The genetic profile pointed to one person, Thomas R. Daniels. Genealogical analysis was methodical, documented, and verifiable. Add proximity and opportunity. Daniels was a shipyard contractor working in Norfolk in 1986. He lived within a mile of Phillips' apartment complex. His work brought him into contact with Navy personnel. He had access. He had opportunity. Add the staging of the crime scene. Some of Phillips' belongings were missing, others scattered in a way suggesting deliberate manipulation rather than random theft. The attack was violent, personal, excessive. Add the witnesses. People who knew Daniels described his behavior after the murder as paranoid, injured, and evasive. His hands were scraped. His face was bruised. He looked over his shoulder. He made cryptic comments suggesting knowledge or guilt. The prosecutor paused. Philip J. Geary was attacked and killed near his home in 1986. Thomas R. Daniels' DNA was at the crime scene. He lived nearby. He worked in the area. He knew Philip. His behavior after the murder was consistent with guilt. The defense attorney stood, projecting calm skepticism. Genetic genealogy was new and evolving. Family tree construction involved interpretations and assumptions. Witnesses were recalling events from more than 30 years ago. Human memory was fallible, shaped by time and suggestion. Where was the motive? The burden of proof was on the state. The judge instructed the jury carefully, explaining the legal standards they must apply. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Inside the jury room, 12 people wrestled with science, memory, and the weight of deciding another person's fate. On the afternoon of the second day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, air thick with anticipation. Phillips' family returned to their seats, faces drawn with exhaustion and hope. Daniels sat beside his defense attorney, expression unreadable. The judge took the bench and the jury filed in. Their faces revealed nothing. The foreperson stood when asked, holding a folded piece of paper. The verdict was read aloud, guilty of first-degree murder. The word hung in the air before the courtroom reacted. Phillips' family members embraced, tears flowing freely. Some cried in relief. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the end of a wait that had lasted more than 3 decades. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing date. Daniels was remanded into custody, led away by bailiffs as the courtroom slowly emptied. Weeks later, the courtroom assembled again for sentencing. The judge heard victim impact statements from Phillips' family. They spoke of birthdays without him, holidays with an empty chair, decades of wondering who had taken him from them. They thanked investigators for never giving up, for preserving evidence when it would have been easier to discard it, for using new science to bring old crimes into the light. The judge sentenced Thomas Daniels to life in prison without possibility of parole. In remarks from the bench, the judge acknowledged the role of forensic DNA evidence, genealogical analysis, and preserved crime scene materials in reaching this outcome. The judge noted that justice delayed was not justice denied, that Phillips' family had waited long enough, and that the sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the decades of pain it had caused. Daniels was led away. Phillips' family stepped out of the courthouse, carrying both grief and hard-won closure. Sometime after the trial, Quiet settled over the Norfolk Police Cold Case Unit and Philip's family home. Sunlight filtered through windows, suggesting a fragile sense of peace. Law enforcement reflected on how preserved evidence, genetic genealogy, national database connectivity, and coordinated investigative units made this case solvable despite decades of silence. Internal reports and training materials cited Philip's case as an example for future investigators, emphasizing importance of evidence preservation and revisiting unsolved files. Philip's family began to frame his story not only as loss, but as testament to persistence and the eventual triumph of truth. The verdict could not restore Philip's life, but it finally answered questions that had haunted them. They learned that Philip J. Geary's name now stood as a landmark example of what modern forensic science could achieve, becoming a reference point in discussions about cold cases and justice. The case contributed to public faith that even very old crimes could be solved, encouraging families of other victims to keep pushing for reviews and new testing. Media coverage highlighted how advanced technology, patient genealogical work, and the foresight of 1986 investigators who chose to preserve rather than discard evidence had combined to break through decades of silence. The Norfolk community absorbed the resolution with mixed emotions: shock that someone who had lived among them quietly for years was responsible for such violence, relief that the case was finally solved, renewed awareness that justice, even when it arrives late, still carries meaning. For the Cold Case Unit, Philip's case became proof that persistence mattered, that no victim should be forgotten, and that time could not erase what science and determination could reveal. The detectives who had pulled that dusty file from storage, who had coordinated with genealogists and forensic experts, who had tracked down witnesses across the country, knew their work honored not just Philip, but every unsolved case still waiting. The story closed on an image of Philip's name, a photograph, a memorial, a quiet acknowledgement that evidence can speak long after time has passed, and that persistence, science, and determination can break even the deepest cold.